You're listening to The Breakup Theory, conversations on ending things and collective liberation. In today's episode, River and I return to a conversation about Gaza, focusing on the discourse surrounding it, the function of antisemitism and the colonial creation of Israel, the state of resistance and the state of Israel's genocide, as well as decolonization and the way whiteness and identification with institutions hampers leftist solidarity with decolonial movements. Perhaps a fitting epigraph for today's episode would be a line from Aimé Césaire that River quotes in our conversation. Europe is indefensible. The end of Israel is not enough. We need the end of Europe and the end of the United States. One facet of our discussion is trying to get at the way we can find true solidarity with and inspiration from the resistance in Palestine. How do we bring the decolonial force from the colony to the heart of empire? In thinking about this, we touch on what stops people from having solidarity or what trips up white leftists in their conceptions of decolonization. We also talk a bit about knowledge production in the academy and writing and thinking during this endless series of horrors surrounding us and escalating every day. But don't worry, it's not just doom and gloom. We find hope in the ways that Palestinians and others are teaching us life away from the state. Remember, as always, we have an online submission form at forum.jotform.com/thebreakuptheory/stories and a phone line at 917-426-6548. Please write us and call us to share your breakup stories, your questions about ending things, and your hopes for liberation. Our Letters episodes are a recurring feature on the show, and we find that our writers appreciate the way we help think of these situations, so keep writing us. I'm excited to hear what's going on. If you like this show, please share with your friends and rate and follow us wherever you get podcasts. You can also support the project and my writing by subscribing to my Patreon at patreon.com/thebreakuptheory. If you have any extra cash, you can sign up for $5 a month, though nothing there is paywalled. On my Patreon, I regularly post both short and long written pieces, along with episodes and other conversations I'm having. I'm so grateful for all of you supporting me in this project. The Breakup Theory is a member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. CZN brings together a slew of amazing audio projects, so check them out at channelzeronetwork.com. And now, our discussion. So, River and I wanted to get together to talk about a few things that are going on, focusing first on the kind of current state of, I guess, discourse around Israel's genocide in Gaza and then responses to it. And then maybe we'll also talk a little bit about writing and thinking in a time of genocide. But yeah, let's start with Israel and sort of how Netanyahu is portrayed, sort of as an exceptional figure. Because you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so one phrase that has been sort of going around my head in the last year or so is this phrase from Aimé Césaire: Europe is indefensible. And I was thinking about Israel and the fact that we, for example, in Germany now you can get arrested simply for saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, because it's understood as not accepting Israel's right to exist, right? So I wanted to think about what does it mean because, instinctively I think Israel is not defensible, and that is intimately connected for me with the notion of Europe being indefensible. And the way I see this is that it is, of course, Europe that created Israel, right? So with the Balfour Declaration, the British said to the Zionist organization, we promise you that you can have this land and you can make this your own and create a state here. And then, of course, the 1930s, 1940s, the expulsion, the violence, eventually the Holocaust was Europe trying to rid itself of its Jewish population, right? So, and even after the Second World War ended, like we in Britain, I say we because I'm based in London, I'm not actually British, but in Britain, Britain always sees itself as being like a liberator, right? Along with the US in the Second World War. So it sees itself as the innocent or the good party in the Second World War. But of course, we know that when both the Jewish people were starting to flee Germany, etc., during the war, Britain and the US didn't want to take them. And also even after liberation, when Auschwitz was liberated, when these sort of completely emaciated people were found still alive there, like Britain didn't want them, the US didn't want them. They had to have their arms twisted to have just a few of them. Churchill it's come out late, or it's become better known lately, that he was a massive anti-Semite and said some pretty horrendous things. So by then basically sending those people and paving the way for and creating the state of Israel for the Jewish people to have this homeland in the Middle East. It's a continuation of Europe trying to get rid of the Jews from Europe in its own midst. And so Europe creating Israel is also one of the last remaining colonial projects, right? So we know that, of course, Europe had many colonies around the world, colonized three-quarters of the world pretty much. And most of those places are being sort of decolonized. To what extent you can say that project is complete is another question. But we had the news of the Chagos Islands this week, where you can see that decolonization is always conditional, right? Because Britain so generously gave the Chagos Islands back, not to Chagosian people, but to another sovereign state. And on the basis they could keep their military base there, right? So in a sense, creating the State of Israel was also an opportunity for Europe and the US to have this kind of satellite colony in a strategically, economically, etc. important region. And I think when I say like this is anti-Semitic, I said to you earlier, this is an anti-Semitic thing, right? It's both anti-Semitic in that part of the idea was that it helps get rid of the Jews in Europe and to some extent block more people from coming to the US. It is also anti-Semitic in that you're putting people in a position as a colonizing, settling people. You're exposing them to the violence that is inevitably going to be happening when you create a colony, right? So there is going to be resistance, especially if there is an existing population there that is going to be displaced or in some way, or eradicated or whatever, as commonly happens with colonies. So it is anti-Semitic in those two ways.
One thing I think that confuses some people or makes it hard, or it's hard for people to hold at once these two truths about Israel, right? Like one that you're telling right now is that the creation of Israel isn't contradictory with anti-Semitism, right? That anti-Semitism, in fact, was foundational to Israel, and even the Zionists knew that and talked about it. But then there's the discourse that comes from Israel, and then the sort of the Hasbara, the propaganda that they've saturated diasporic Jews with, which is that Israel needs to exist to keep Jews safe. And I think that depending on what position you are, you'll only uphold one side of those things. But I think there's something about putting them together. Now, I'm also thinking, today I saw Zoe Samudzi, who I think is brilliant. I sent it to you, but on Instagram, she was commenting on this article that came out in the last couple of days that's talking about the blood libel, which is this it can be applied to different kinds of people, but it was historically this idea that the Jews were killing Christian babies, right? The blood is that they were using the blood for cooking or baking matzah, I don't know, whatever. But so this guy was writing an article that's saying that accusing the Israelis of killing Palestinian babies is just another iteration of the blood libel. And she was well, first of all, how do you say that when it's factually true that babies are being killed? But then her analysis that I found interesting was saying that Israel talks about anti-Semitism and combating anti-Semitism as if they're currently in the Holocaust or in Middle Ages Europe, right? And she's Israel isn't Strasbourg in the 1300s or whatever. It's not Spain at the removal of the Jews and the Muslims, right? But they're acting as if that's the case all the time. So that one narrative about Jews being safe from Israel is an attempt to maintain a certain kind of understanding of anti-Semitism as a constant threat. And then I think you were gesturing towards this, and we talked a little bit as we were planning this. It doesn't account for the fact then that the formation of Israel as a settler state and the continuation of Israel and its aggression actually fuels anti-Semitism, right? Like, I mean, we say the same thing about US's imperial wars, that it creates people who hate the US and want to see the end of it. And Israel, I mean, honestly, like the sort of idea of the Muslim terrorist was created by Israel, right? Like that wasn't something that was like happening before Israel's foundation. That whatever state or region or non-state actors these people are associated with, the kind of, I think the amplification of that kind of violence came after Israel was created. So, right, it doesn't keep Jews safe. Actually, it helps to create a worldwide hatred of Israel. The other thing I wanted to say in terms of like colonization and, Israel as a kind of final outpost of Europe. I mean, there's a few things like, yes, like the European American project is indefensible, and Israel is part of that. Israel is like the last formation of that. As someone was talking about, the difference with Israel and other settlers states is that they don't have a relationship to like a originating state, right? They're not like a satellite directly of any. I guess people can call them a client state or whatever of the U.S., but they have a certain kind of sovereignty that's different than like other settler colonies as they began. But yeah, I think that like people witnessing the genocide in Gaza and who had not sort of thought about Israel's treatment of the Palestinians before will not totally understand that what we're witnessing is what the like US frontier was like, right? Like it was a mass military campaign against resisting indigenous people. And I think that then we can think about the sort of economic aspects of this, that like Israel, founded as a homeland for Jews in a place where Jewish identity would then be of an exceptional status, it can't exist where all the Jews have everything, right? It will necessarily have a stratified class society if it's based on capitalism, right? And Israel can't maintain this promise for Jews without continually, finding sources of primitive accumulation, whether that's like through taking over the land or taking property from people, or creating, like you said, an unending military state that its whole economy is based on that. And one of what we've seen, leading up to this in the last 20, 30 years is that, like all the other neoliberal capitalist states, Israel isn't serving most people anymore, right? And so they need to distract people from that they don't have the same upward or even stable class status. And so one of the things they do is they promise land to people, right? Because that's the major way that you can maintain some kind of economic stability in the world. So like that's the other thing that I think we're seeing. And the US is in a different historical place than that as a settler colony, because it has already sort of conquered all the land within its borders and is now doing repetitive versions of primitive accumulation over and over again that are like levels up. But that, I mean, I think that aspect is sort of not thought of because of this discourse around anti-Semitism and the propaganda that says there's like some kind of like racial blood feud between the Jews and the Arabs, right? It's actually like there's like more concrete reasons for this and more immediate reasons for this. This is also something maybe that you wanted to talk about specifically around the figure of Netanyahu and how he's framed.
Yeah. I was also thinking when you were talking about farmers, right? So yesterday I was listening to It's Going Down episode on where they also talk about Palestine, Lebanon, and one of the speakers was talking about how he's from the Rust Belt and how the farmers, or he was actually talking about Springfield, right? Springfield, Ohio, and how they invited in these Haitians come and work there when domestic family farms were no longer a thing. And I remember growing up in Holland, how the farming communities around us, like the farmers around us, when sort of EU subsidies and like the way that farming just isn't economical anymore unless you do it on a massive scale, and there not being a space for that in small European countries, but then farmers moving to the US, right, and like sending back pictures from these lands that were like, these massive combine harvesters, and like their fields as far as the eye can see were theirs. And so that is sort of like continuation of colonization, European colonization of the US, but people sort of moving across for economic reasons. And it made me think about the way that farmers, right, and if you think about South Africa, white European or Dutch farmers. So colonization, right? So when the Europeans colonize various countries, they use these particular populations to do so, right? So they use, Australia famously, they sent the convicts there, right, to settle the land. the US, they sent farmers, and they had religious minorities who weren't like the people on the Mayflower, etc. with them. So, and Israel is created by also a religious group that they're always like either an underclass or a surplus population or like an unwanted population that gets sent to settle. And of course, it makes sense then that you also become kind of entrenched and you have this frontier mentality and you become like defensive about the space that you have, given that you were pushed out of where you were. But that's not to say that that is okay. It's just sort of to name a fact, like historical fact.
That's this part of the story of the US, right? Is like, and it's similar with Israel and what we were talking about with anti-Semitism, is that the kind of first colonizers were embattled in this way, right? And like persecuted. But there's the other like economic story is that there wasn't room for a lot of economic development for people in Europe or in England or whatever. And so there's a promise of like that, of the possibility of land and some upward mobility, and that then these like persecuted minorities become this kind of, you know, vanguard of the colony. And I think that's the same thing with Israel, right? That like the Jews in Europe, I mean, there were class differences between sort of more assimilated Jews who would identify more with the state that they lived in, right, than with Jewishness in particular. And then like the kind of, you know, shtetl Jews or the ghetto Jews and they would look down upon them. But there's this idea that Israel would create the possibility of economic opportunity. And even like, I think the image of Israel, like as like somehow originally as like a socialist state kind of helps play into this idea. There's something also there, I think, about whiteness and the kind of ascension of Jews to whiteness through the state of Israel.
I was going to say that I think that in the US and in Australia, for example, you no longer have this identity that people hold on to, except for the aspect of whiteness, right? Whereas in Israel, it's Jewishness and whiteness, as you say. But I think that in Europe, now switching over to sort of contemporary and how we look at Netanyahu, or even how people on the left, because I think I've seen a lot of people over the past year get active on Palestine. I've also seen a lot of people sort of be like, okay, yeah, so this is happening. I guess this is the new normal, whatever. And I guess these people are just, and sort of being quite comfortable with trying to say, oh, well, that's just these people doing that crazy stuff over there, right? It's nothing to do with us. And I think that, you know, or saying like, oh, it's Netanyahu, he's just beholden to his far-right cabinet, like his ministers, Ben Gvir and Smotrich and so on, who are just like complete lunatics, and he's somehow even not free to do anything other than what he's doing. And I think that these are just things that people say in order to then draw a line between themselves within our European metropole as civilized, and those people over there doing that crazy shit as not civilized or barbarous, right? And I think that Netanyahu is, of course, is possibly very conscious of this, because he's also in the UN the other day, he was really making that speech very clearly about we are the civilized and they are the barbarians that are like threatening us, you know, with his map with the countries in black, were literally like the sort of axis of evil or axis of resistance that are, you know, literally color black versus him grouping himself with the white civilized. So I think it's something that we should be incredibly conscious of when we think, okay, well, we've tried marching, we've been on the street every Saturday or every other Saturday, we've done our demos, we've donated to a few charities and so on. But apparently it's just the crazy stuff that these people do over there. They just will keep fighting each other. I need to get on with my life. Let's have another baby, whatever. And I think if we do that, we are so clearly making that very same mistake, like sticking our heads in the sand and not understanding that it is not just Israel that is indefensible, it's Europe that's indefensible. We have the same, it is us, right? Like it is Keir Starmer, it is Biden, it is Macron, it is all of those guys that finance, that support, that allow. If Biden didn't want Israel to bomb Beirut or to bomb Gaza, he'd just get on the phone and stop it right there and then, and it would stop, right? If Keir Starmer wanted it all to stop, he would stop the enormous amount of arms shipments that leave from the UK if the Germans wanted it to stop, etc., etc. But no, we in Europe are what is making all that stuff happen. And I think that we as European liberals or lefties need to understand, not only is it not the crazy barbarian sort of, because that's how I see that as an anti-Semitic thing, like trying to other those people over there in that region. We also have the exact same sentiment here in our own governments, in our own states, right? I know that Keir Starmer and Biden, etc., look like nice guys, but they are literally allowing this thing to continue. And of course, in many countries like in Germany and the Netherlands and France, we have the far right in government that are openly saying things quite similar to the Smotrich and the Ben-Gvirs of this world as well.
Yeah, I want to come back to that idea, like, because I think this is really important that we present Netanyahu and his right-wing government as somehow different than like the government in the US, which is also held hostage by a reactionary group and which has been built up over decades, similar to Israel. Like they're the same. I want to come back to that, but like first, like some of the other stuff you said, and also think about like Europe and whiteness. Like, I mean, okay, first, like there's something in a talk that I did recently with Cindy Milstein, and we were talking about the sort of limitations of anarchist action. And Milstein was saying that like we're kind of coming up against this thing that like even as anarchists, we retain some kind of hope that someone will step in, right, in our attempts to like do Palestinian solidarity, because we know that like individually we can't just like go stop the genocide. There's still this feeling that like a world power is gonna come in and be like, you can't do this, but they haven't done that, right? Like non-state actors have done it in a way, like the Houthis and Hezbollah, which is like, I guess, semi-state, and now we're seeing Iran come in, but like it hadn't happened for a year. And so that is information that we need to like sort of integrate in a way. And then, yeah, I think you were talking about the kind of potential falling off of people, you know, being interested or committed to Palestine. Like, I think there's another part of that, which is a threat to whiteness, right? Like we can stand political movement in solidarity with the people who are suffering as victims, right? And then we can like represent them as just being suffering people, like, and ultimately weak in that way. But we cannot integrate, accept, support this idea of Palestine as actually the front of decolonial armed resistance, right? Like I hear a lot of it, like leftist anarchists talking about this, but it's obviously not the main discourse, right? And even like a lot of left liberal anarchist people will hesitate to support this kind of armed resistance because of Hamas as, you know, authoritarian, or all these reasons why. And I mean, also including violence, but like this is actually something that is important. It's where a conflagration has risen that threatens the white European American hegemony potentially, right? We don't know, but like it's a potential threat. So I think like that is where we find the limitation of solidarity for white people, right? To see that like that they wouldn't support the armed resistance because ultimately that's a threat to our kind of positionality as, you know, as white.
I don't think Biden is beholden to a far right group of people or whatever. If Biden is the president of the United States, he can say whatever the beep he wants, right? If he doesn't like it, he can say, I'm not doing it. Like he's not in prison. He's a free man. He's the president of the United States. Like he's in charge. So yeah, for sure. If he didn't do what XYZ people wanted, then things would change in a way that maybe he couldn't be president again. And I mean, he's not going to be president. So like, exactly, right? Like there's nothing stopping. I mean, there's nothing actually stopping him. He might use the excuse, but there's nothing actually stopping him from picking up the phone to Netanyahu. But the thing is that he's not. And that is, I think, something that we're not taking seriously enough, right? Like you were saying with the conversation with Milstein, it's not that we have to stop expecting. We have to stop being so incredibly naive to think that these people who are the president of the United States, or these people who are like the governments of states, right, are in it, are doing it because they want to do the best job they possibly can to like create a beautiful life for people, and so that everyone can thrive and be happy and live in peace. That is not what drives these people, right? You don't get to be president of the US if you're a nice guy. like that. That's not how the system. If that was the case, we didn't have to be anarchists, right? If that was actually how it worked, then we could all just be social democrats. But the fact is that we, as anarchists or as Marxists who, believe in a world without borders, without states, a self-managed society where we don't have the hierarchy of and the systems of states like police and power and all that stuff. But yeah, you were saying that also in response to a conversation with Milstein, none of us can individually stop the genocide. No, we cannot individually stop the genocide, but the kind of society that we believe in, that we want and need to build, is one of collective effort, right? We can only stop the genocide. Well, I don't think we can stop the genocide at all. It will stop when it stops. But I think we can possibly prevent the next genocide by building collectively so massively and so powerfully, ultimately, that we can create a world without borders.
I mean, no, I wasn't saying we can't individually stop the genocide or even collectively right now stop it to mean that we don't do anything. I think what I was trying to say is that we take inspiration from this front that has been opened by an armed decolonial movement and try to find ways to, within the empire the metropoles of the empire, find our own ways of threat and attack and betray whiteness, right? And I don't know that I have a prescriptive idea of what that looks like. And I don't think that we're not capable, we're not in the position of doing what's happening in Palestine, really. But I think that that's sort of what's at stake in the idea of stopping the next one from happening. And there's multiple ongoing genocides right now, right? This isn't the only one. It's the one that we're focusing on the most because of Israel's stature in the world. And to clarify what I was saying in terms of the heads of state, when I say that, I'm not saying Biden in particular is held hostage by a reactionary right wing. I think that the US state has been over decades, that whether or not the Republican Party is in power, it basically dictates the terms of the playing field, or the rules of the playing field. And this has become even more clear with the Supreme Court, which is basically just decreeing things that totally change the structure of living under law in the US. And the Democrats, while they present themselves as a kind of the only hope we have against that, literally do nothing to stop it. And the biggest case of this is the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and the whole history of 50 years of the people in political power who had the possibility of doing something to protect abortion or even expand access to it, literally did nothing. They didn't do anything. And so again, it's this image we have of choice in politics through the state that I don't think is actually true. And so ultimately people like Keir Starmer or Biden or Macron, who are nominally liberal, their interests don't contradict the interests of these reactionary and fascist groups, because what they are helming a state structure, and the state structure needs to do these things to contain state power. And given the place we are in terms of what's happening in the sort of global economy with capitalism, they're no longer giving the populations of the white populations of Europe and the US the carrot, right? It's they're only giving us the stick. It's getting worse and worse. They've maintained order and the sort of racial order historically through, at these moments of crisis, often throwing crumbs to the massive people. And that's not happening, right? We're having more and more taken away from us, which also helps fuel the fascist movement, because it's one of the possible outcomes when you're especially when you're a white person with no options, you can be seductive to join these groups and maintain some kind of shred of superiority through whiteness. So those people could become leftists, but they don't. So that's sort of what I'm talking about in terms of because I thought you were very astute in saying that there isn't such a huge difference. We want to exceptionalize Netanyahu as some crazy person, but there isn't really a huge difference. And to kind of hopefully maybe bring this together, I'm seeing this in the US there's a new attempt to make Zionism a protected identity. And this is coming out through universities and colleges, and I have friend, colleague, someone I'm collaborating with, who an article just came out about her firing as a tenured professor for making a tweet that was critical of Zionists, and a student took out a case against her because she identifies as Zionist, which is that it was like I think a Title IX case, so that she could be fired over kind of attacking a protected identity. And like at another school that I'm teaching at NYU, this is also a new policy that criticism of Zionism is like it's like putting it on the same line as racism or sexism, right? And so I was trying to make some kind of connection where like the sort of the what we see as the craziness of Netanyahu is just getting funneled back into the maintenance of the hegemony of these identities, which is also why we saw such extensive repression of the encampments, and because it was to maintain this social order against the potential rising up of people against it.
Absolutely. I think that's the boomerang effect Césaire also talks about, right? And I think tangentially here, they protect so-called gender critical speech as a protected belief, right? It's protected belief. But so they can't fire you for tweeting. But then, I mean, if that is how Zionism is viewed, then also Zionism should be viewed.
No, the other part of the policy is that they're taking on this definition that was like proposed in Congress and then as part of like trainings that, are funded by these Zionist groups, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
Yeah, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, we have that here too. Yeah, it's most universities, for instance, have adopted that.
Right. Well, it's interesting, the comparison with the gender critical, because the other thing that happens in the US is the protection of like Christians. But it's like clearly these power plays where like these cases come before the Supreme Court where people are like supposedly asserting their religious rights in an attempt to control the behaviors of other people. But they frame it as a kind of individual freedom. But like then they're like, well, my religious rights mean that I don't have to give my employees healthcare that funds contraception, or like I don't have to make a cake for a gay wedding. Like there are all these like hypothetical situations that they use to maintain this. So like it's just another example of the kind of the dominant identity positioning itself as a victim, which is like one of the hallmarks of fascism, and ultimately gets to use the tools of state to protect itself.
Yeah, and I guess like earlier when we were chatting before, I was saying that I think people on the left should, because it is tempting to sort of say, okay, well, I'm an anti-fascist, so I fight the far right on the streets of London. That was my thing, and Palestine is somehow like a little bit removed from me. But at the same time, like we were just saying, these things are so absolutely, completely connected through Israel being a product of a creation by Europe and needed for Europe to maintain its whiteness, etc., and connected to the far right, even emerging and remaining strong here. I was thinking, by the way, of a conversation I had with a man who worked in a hardware store here, like a building supply store, and he was like, yes, I used to be pro-Palestinian, but now I'm just want Netanyahu to finish a job, and and by the way, you do know they control the world and stuff, and like he had a completely incoherent understanding. But I tried to talk to him for about half an hour in the shop, try to get him to sort of articulate what exactly, try to show up for himself how incoherent he was. But at the same time, I came away understanding that basically if you're like a poor white dude with not a lot of economic possibility, then you're going to want to join the winning side. So it might have looked last October like the Palestinians were the winning side, the freedom fighters, the people that stood up against, to liberate themselves. And then maybe by now you're thinking, oh shit, like Lebanon's getting it. Gaza's really completely obliterated. Maybe it's time for me to switch sides and switch to the winning side here, right? So I understand that instinct, but I think ultimately I still believe, and I think that's really where I wanted to go with this conversation as well. Like you were saying about this discomfort of the white lefty, and there is no other way but for us to join the struggle for liberation as, speaking to white lefties and fighting with our siblings here, in this decolonial movement, which it ultimately is. And I wanted to recommend the work here, the writing of Nadine El-Anani, who speaks about the internal colonialism of Britain, right? The British Empire exists within its within these islands even, right? So the way that the police, for instance, massively disproportionately targets people of color, and this is the same in the US, of course. So the decolonization needs to happen like right here and right around us as well. And there is no other way to fight for global liberation and to fight for us to fight alongside in solidarity with and for all our liberation.
Yeah, I think that's so important to emphasize. And I'm sure like a lot of people know this and think this, but also I don't think it's a dominant strain in the kind of Western Palestinian solidarity movement. There's again an exceptionalization of Israel as like a bad actor, but I think this is really attached to whiteness and the fear and refusal of white people to give up whiteness. But like Palestinian liberation does need to mean the end of Europe and the end of the US. And like we have these struggles at home that are linked, like Black liberation, like land back for indigenous people here in the US, and all these like, yeah, like you can say, I mean, this is an argument that people made a lot in the 60s and 70s, like internal colonies to these states, right? That was like a big thing in the kind of Black nationalist movement to think of Black people in America as an internal colony. And that would create a way to link up with indigenous struggle too.
Of course.
Yeah, I think that needs to be foregrounded a lot more in our devising of our actions and also maybe the discourse. But like, you know, people don't want to maintain that threat. People are really driven towards some kind of like, they want like more immediate concrete wins or go towards more immediate concrete objectives. So it's like ceasefire, it's divestment, or even just like minimally like a candidate who like will mention this, whatever, you know, like I think that kind of takes the space of kind of pushing the analysis through that these things are all linked. So like if say Palestine is able to win against Israel, the fight isn't over, you know. Like, and like I don't know, like, you know, the same question about how we haven't seen any other world powers step in to stop Israel. We know that like when insurgent forces do liberate themselves and form states or other things, that the world powers come in to try to stop them or take control of them, right? So right, if Palestine somehow won or freed itself and we didn't throw off Europe and US, it would just continue in another way.
Until victory.
It's time for a break. And we're back. Well, do you want to talk a little bit also about like thinking and writing during this? Because we've also been having this conversation as we've worked on different essays, projects, being like, you know, at the same time that we're like making editorial changes on our pieces, like witnessing this, you know, unending horror or multiple horrors, right? With like climate disaster here in the US.
Yeah, climate disaster everywhere, yeah. So I was recently going to participate in this like academic event where they called it epistolary international law. And they were going to talk about like all these letters that like legal scholars and other people have written about the genocide, and that then you get sent around and everyone has to sign by noon the next day and whatever. And they were saying like, they were going to have this whole discussion, and then the call for papers or the event as advertised also asked, so if we're not going to do this, then what should we do? And then I basically responded to that and wanted to participate in the event and say, actually, fuck those letters. Like, need to normalize getting out of our ivory towers and into the streets and actually being on the metaphorical barricades. And the idea that just because you're a scholar, a lawyer, an academic or whatever, you should be doing that stuff is just a way for you to stay within your comfort zone, within your privilege, and to not have to admit that you cannot do anything useful. That perhaps the most useful thing is to make sandwiches for the revolution. I think we talked about this.
Yeah, right. I mean, I feel implicated in this, and also like I'm trying to fight it in ways that like this kind of knowledge production factory of so-called like, academic radicals, or I don't know, even like the leftist media sphere, I think in lots of moments feels questionable. I think like more academics are kind of guilty of like producing knowledge that it's really feeding off of, parasitic off these moments and instances, or just the systems of oppression, because they're like there to critique them, right? And I found this in my attempts to publish too, that if I write something that isn't simply critique, but also like towards action, no one wants to publish it. Like no one wants to publish that stuff. They want you to take that stuff out and just sort of be like descriptive, analytic critique of things,
Yeah.
which like, leaves us in this kind of vicious circle of like naming all the problems and being like, oh, well, I guess that's where we're stuck.
Done. Job done. Yeah.
Right. And so there is like a desire to break out of that. I feel like because I don't know, I like writing, and I feel like I'm decent at it. I like having these conversations. I like hope that they make some kind of contribution, because one of the other things that I think we have to imagine happening, I don't know, this might be too Marxist, like programmatic, but like that as these terrible things accelerate and more people are exposed directly to the kind of bald workings of empire, like that there's something to do about like kind of bringing people into the fold through talking about these things that they haven't heard maybe spoken about at the same time, and also drawing the connections between these different struggles, because I think it's really easy to get involved in like a movement that's like single issue and not making the connection like we've been talking about, like Palestinian liberation is tied to like the end of Europe and the end of the US, the end of empire. So I think that, I don't know, there might be some usefulness, but it is really clear that there's been a whole kind of industry built up of thought work around Palestine, and a lot of it won't deal with, again, armed resistance. Yeah.
Well, here in the UK, you go to prison for saying you support armed resistance. So
right. I think we're on the way there in the US, and they're trying out all these, domestic terrorism charges on anarchists. I think there's more attention being given to these strains than previously.
There was a woman arrested on the demo on Saturday for wearing a t-shirt with this upside down red triangle.
Oh yeah.
Intifada and revolution. That's it. You get arrested for that. And you get arrested also for having random Arabic words that the cops can't read. So they think it probably does, obviously in their racist minds, it's anything written in Arabic is going to be terrorists. So.
Right. I've been walking around with a sweatshirt with the upside down triangle. I always think that because it looks like it could be slightly pink, that people just maybe think it's like a gay thing. But yeah.
I should recommend that Homer Zion article by Hussein Omar, who actually talks about the pink triangle and the Zionism of Kramer, the guy who started.
Barry Kramer, yeah. ACT UP.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's in the Parapraxis. That's a good essay. But, one more thing, just thinking about academics, because this is something that I keep coming across too, thinking about the difference between like me and the shit that I do and stuff that I see other people do. Like there's academic knowledge production that is speaking to academics, right? And then holds itself to the standards of the academy. And in a way then is like reproducing itself, the power structure, the institution through its work. And often this is like treated as like, good work because it's sticking to those things. And then there's people who are doing research and analysis that is speaking to movements. And I think that like I see that so clearly as a difference. I mean, personally, like, I translated this book by Guy Ockenghem and made choices in my translation to connect it to the people struggling now, specifically like around transliteration, which could have been in ways, messing with history or changing the way that we understand it. But I made that decision because I was like, everything that Ockenghem is writing about here is going on still, or like we're repeating it, and so it needs to speak to people in the streets, not to people. And like also Ockenghem himself was like involved in movements, and his role in academia was like, it was marginal. So but yeah, I think that might be the difference. And so the people who are doing this knowledge production, like, I mean, the thing that maybe this is like a kind of a truism by now, I know it like comes sort of like out of Black feminism too, is that you can only theorize from the practice, not just coming in and eating it, you know?
Absolutely. And the academy is indefensible too.
Yeah.
Everyone should join the movement. Everyone should be in the movement. Everything should be if you're a scholar, researcher, your scholarship, your research should be in the service of the movement. Everything else. I mean, obviously, if you're a medical researcher and your job is to find causes of disease and so on, that's also in the benefit of like the greater good and all our thriving. But what I'm saying is that if you're not working in support of the movement for liberation, then you're working against it.
Yeah. I mean, I think this was the major limitation of the campus movements in the US, or at least how I experienced it, is that like there was a confusion because it was a campus movement of where it could get turned back into improving the institution, right? Or like thought about in that way. And, you know, in my positionality within the campus stuff, I was like, I don't believe that the institution can be bettered. And I don't want to put my energy into that. Like, I want my energy to be towards disrupting and destroying this institution, even if it's where I like, you know, how I feed myself. Yeah. And I just saw that sort of hijack a lot of the movements. And that's a tendency within all kind of radical movements to be hijacked towards a kind of reformist perspective. But I think it is important to say that like any work within the academy that is actually going to like be faithful or do justice or whatever word, I don't know what to say, to honor the movement in the streets has to be against the institution. And I think this is like, again, what I've been talking about in terms of whiteness too. And the major limitation I see is that we don't want to give up our comforts, right? A lot of people don't want to give that stuff up because it's scary to think what's on the other side, even though like freedom is on the other side. The sort of meager comforts of this world now, especially for within whiteness, keep people holding on to the structures. So like that is another, like the destroying the institution that you like feed off of is scary because you're like, what's on the other side? And we don't know like necessarily. I mean, we can see things in like, you know, in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene in North Carolina and the surrounding areas that people like can make life, you know, on a daily basis, although it's still in a way dependent on these supply chains and the commodities produced by capitalism. So I don't know.
Yeah, it did make me think listening to that report on the mutual aid being done in North Carolina at the moment. And absolutely, it's brilliant. And people do come together and we can organize life. And we can organize life, right? We don't need the state to organize our lives for it. But at the same time, it did make me think, can we rethink quite how much of our lives is dependent on electricity? Quite how much of our life depends on access to the internet or etc., etc. Can we at least keep those skills, keep the tools, keep the knowledge to go back to basics if we need to, you know? I think that seems to be incredibly important. You know, I think that I'm sure that's going to be necessary for many millions more of us in the years to come.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening in Western North Carolina also brings really into the foreground the problem of water, because a lot of the water systems were kind of failed through the flooding. And then also people who like had groundwater, like well access or springs, a lot of the stuff has been compromised by like toxic chemical leaks and that stuff from the breakdown of that other infrastructure. And so like that's another aspect. And like, I don't know, ultimately, I think the long process of capitalism, in addition to turning the world into a labor camp, as Freddie Perlman says, is to make us forget and feel powerless about making life. And so like it's a long process of bringing people into the structure of enforced labor by taking them away from knowing how to live. And so at the point where we're at, which is so far along for so many of us, especially in the US and Europe, that we feel so distant from like knowing what to do or like, and I think, I mean, it's the same thing also with like sort of spiritual beliefs and kind of like coming into the religion of capitalism. We just like, we can't conceive of the world and our place within it right now outside of these structures, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking that there are so many videos coming out of Gaza that you can watch on Instagram that are like basically people making I saw a video of a guy who made a charger for phones out of literally a piece of wood and cutting bits of metal, and then like he created this like multi-plug setup with a piece of wood, and like other people are creating ovens out of clay, or like some guy built a little house on the beach using bags that he filled with sand and then sticking clay to the walls and so on. Like they teach life, right? There is this famous poem by Rafif Ziada, "We Teach Life, Sir," that you can watch on YouTube as well.
Yeah.
And you can see the Gazans teach us life every day in those clips, every day in the ways that they are surviving. Well, fewer and fewer of them each day, but in the way that people are making food for themselves, making homes for themselves, even making moments of joy for themselves and their loved ones, their families, their community. And that is what you see. I believe that capacity within people and that drive within people is why, I believe that we can get to a world without states, without borders, without etc. Because we have that within us. We have that within our communities. And yeah, that's beautiful. And that's basically it. That's what we're fighting for.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful place to maybe wrap it up. And like, yeah, I agree that people can actually do this and we can learn. And the witnessing of, it's like this twofold thing in Palestine, both the armed struggle, which is inspiring, and the making of life that's happening simultaneously, I think is that's the other side that's very important. You've been listening to The Breakup Theory. Rate, follow, and share us with your exes. Until next time.